2 of strengths-based coaching. So just to reintroduce us again, my name is Kate Gannon. I work with the Chicago Jobs Council, and my background prior to coming to CJC has been entirely in workforce development. I've done a lot of work with folks who are re-entering the workforce from incarceration, as well as doing on-the-job training in summer and after-school jobs with high school age students. And I will let Melina introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melina, and I am a program coordinator here at the Chicago Jobs Council. I work directly with Kate in our capacity building team. And if you do any of our breakout sessions, please just let me know as soon as possible. That way I can adjust our breakout rooms. And any other questions, you can send them my way.
Thanks, Melina. So just to remind folks of our training objectives for this series, again, these are in your participant guide. You can find them on page 2 of that guide, so you can reference back to them. But we're really focused today on recognizing and building on job seeker strengths, building that collaborative and accountable relationship with job seekers, using tools to support your job seekers in setting and achieving their goals, and incorporating active listening, powerful questions, and visioning into your job seeker meetings. And today for session 2, we're going to have a really strong emphasis on questions. So like I mentioned, this, like last week, will be a pretty interactive session. We're going to be encouraging folks to come off mute and share in the chat, and we will have some opportunities for breakout rooms throughout the session. And I want to remind folks of our grounded agreements from last week. These are just anything that we need to show up and fully be present in today's session. One thing I do want to name in terms of transparent facilitation, we've got some storms going where I am. So Kirsten is on deck to support with screen sharing if needed. My internet is currently telling me that it is full steam ahead, but if I start lagging or freezing, feel free to let me know and we can try to troubleshoot that to get it going. But hopefully the weather here will cooperate. Does anybody have any questions or reflections from last week before we jump in? Fantastic. So just to kind of give us a recap of last week, we really were focused on the foundation of coaching. So we spent a lot of time talking about what are our core values, right? And they're going to inform the way that we approach the work, right? So that's things like having that foundation of respect, that strengths-based approach, really uplifting racial equity and inclusion, practicing a fluidity of approach. So being able to adjust when we need to, right? Not just being set in our ways about our style. Practicing transparency whenever possible. Offering that peer-based support, responsive, right? So these values are the foundation of coaching. These values will affect our mindset and the way that we approach the coaching relationship. The skills that we talked about last week are how we're going to actually do this work, right? So the skills are a little bit more tangible. This is going to be the actual tools that we're using to build a coaching approach. And we're going to really lean in to 2 of these skills today. We're going to focus really heavy on active listening. How do we practice that muscle so that we can really fully tune in to the folks that we're working with, as well as asking powerful questions. I would love to hear from some folks. If you'd like to unmute or share in the chat, what coaching skills have you practiced since last week?
Hey, Kate, this is Kat. Hope you don't mind me
Yes.
unmuting. I have been practicing very hard bottom lining versus allowing the conversation to just drag on. That customer participant is, feeling comfortable to share. So as I'm doing now, so bottom lining, has been a practice area for me, and it's been somewhat successful, I guess.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kat. If you don't mind me asking, what are some of the things that you felt like have made that successful? Is there anything you've done that you feel like really helped with that?
I believe it's taking a note before meetings. I usually take follow-up notes, like tasks to conquer with the customer, so that I stay on track. But I think doing that for every customer versus just having it in my head has been helpful. So, when I have a moment to kind of step in after that participant's pause, I can say, okay, so what is needed to get done today? And so that has helped. And I think also, paraphrasing a little bit, which I know is one of the skills, like active listening, but paraphrasing. Okay, so what I'm understanding is and then, shifting that focus to what the need is. Even though they may have not directly said that, I'm listening and I'm able to decipher and say, okay, this is where I see us moving forward. So writing things down, paraphrasing a little bit have been helpful.
Yeah, writing things down is huge. Having a clear set agenda can really help us make the best use of that 45 minutes to an hour, or sometimes less, that we have with a participant, right? So if at the end of our session, if we make some notes about what we did and what we're going to do, right, which we're all probably doing, sometimes kicking that session off just by saying, all right, Kat, when we met last week, we talked about this, this, and this, and these were our action items. And then as we start getting into that conversation, when we're reframing, especially if somebody's really going on and on and on, that reframe can help that person clock, okay, great, she hears me, she understands me, and that can kind of move us along. So thank you so much for sharing that. Anybody else, were there any coaching skills that you've practiced since last week? Feel free to come off mute or share in the chat. Okay, so we're gonna kick off our content for today with a little reflection. So if you look in your participant guide on page 11, these reflection questions are in your participant guide so that you can reference back in them. I'm going to break us out into a couple of breakout rooms in just a moment. But I want for folks to think about, when was the last time you learned a new skill? And this could be a job-related skill, right? Maybe you recently got trained in a new type of grant administration or budget work or a new approach to working with clients. You could also use a personal skill, right? Maybe you have been doing some projects around your house and you've learned how to use a new tool. So I want you to think about a time that you learned a new skill. And in your groups, you're going to reflect on what were the keys to your success and how did others support you in that process? And again, these questions are on page 11 in your participant guide. Melina, could you drop that link to the participant guide in the chat one more time for anybody who's just joined us? And please do remember, if you're not able to fully participate, let Melina know. And that way she can kind of balance the breakout rooms accordingly. We'll still pop you into a breakout room, but we'll make them a little bit larger if we have more people who can't come off mute and participate. So Melina's put that link to the Google Drive with the participant guide in the chat one more time. So we are going to go into breakout rooms. We'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes in these breakout rooms, just sharing your reflections on a time that you've learned a new skill, and then we'll come back to debrief them as a group. So Melina, whenever you're ready, we can open up those rooms. New skills. Because the process of how we are learning skills can help just kind of, again, root us back in what that experience might be like for the client or the participant that we're working with. So as you're reflecting on the skills that you shared in your breakout room, consider, right, the things that made that really successful, the things that made that really challenging, what support you had, and even some of the emotions that come into skill building. Sometimes we think of skill building as, you know, someone just has to show you how to do it and you're ready to run with it. But a lot of times it takes time, and it can be scary to build new skills, right? There is some vulnerability involved in coming to a coach and saying, I'm not sure where to go from here. I don't know how to do this. So our skills that we're going to focus most closely on today will be this active listening and powerful questions. We're going to think first about listening. And we have a couple of different levels of listening that I want to talk about today. And we can use these levels as a tool to help us gauge where we really are in a conversation. Distracted listening is when we hear the words, but we're not necessarily focused on the meaning. So an example of distracted listening, if anybody has young children in your life, if you have ever been in that position where you're cooking dinner, you are responding to emails, there's a TV on in the background, and there's a dog barking, and the young child in your life is telling you in excruciating detail every single thing that happened in the most recent episode of My Little Pony, you're hearing the words that they're telling you, right? But you probably couldn't repeat that back, right? You're not really processing what they're telling you, because what Applejack did in the last episode of My Little Pony is not as important to you as everything that's happening in your life. So that's distracted listening. I'm hearing what you're saying to me. I'm able to, wow, okay, along with you, but I'm not really retaining any of it. Focused listening is when we're hearing the words and the meaning behind them, but we're really still focused more just on what's being said. So for example, often in a classroom environment, we would be focused listening, right? We're listening to the lecturer, we are maybe taking notes, and we're really just trying to gather the information of what they're saying. We're not necessarily super focused on their body language or their tone of voice or trying to discern what emotions are present in the conversation, because we're just out here trying to get the information. I apologize if you guys are getting that feedback. We've got a lot of thunder right now. Nonverbal listening is where we start to tune into some of that body language. So we're hearing what's being said, we're taking in the meaning, and we're also absorbing that person's body language, their facial expression, their tone. So when we are nonverbal listening, this is when we're going to pick up on more cues, right? When somebody tells us, oh, I'm doing fine, if we're nonverbal listening, we're going to see the way their shoulders sink. We're going to hear that kind of exasperated tone at the end of that fine. And that's going to cue us into, I don't think you are doing fine. I think there's something more happening there. And our fourth level is this whole body listening. And this is when we're really fully present. This is when we have our intuition is activated. We're tuning into the emotions that are present in the conversation. And we're really opening ourselves up to try to hear not just what's being said, but what's in between, right? What's being inferred? And maybe what's being held back. Listening is about more than just seeking out the words and figuring out how to respond or find the right answers. And this is the real heart of coaching. This skill of being able to hear the things that a client is maybe not even aware that they're communicating and help them uncover that. And active listening is how we're going to sculpt some of these really individually tailored, powerful questions. So as coaches, when we are practicing in these levels of nonverbal listening and whole body listening, this is when we will be able to really discern when do we need to just sit quiet and listen? When do we need to let both of us sit in silence? Sometimes we need a moment of silence to process. And when we can pose an inquiry or a powerful question. One thing that came up in the breakout room that I joined was some of the challenges of this whole body listening when there's so much going on around you, right? And I want to name that. This is not an easy thing to do. This is a skill that we build, especially when we are in environments where we have more clients than we can reasonably handle in a day. If you're working in an open concept office, the worst, right? When you can hear your client's conversation, you can hear the conversation from 2 cubes over, there's a phone ringing, there's people walking in and out. If you look in your participant guide in page 12, there's a couple of keys to active listening. I'll walk through them verbally, but want to just note for people that they're in your participant guide, so you don't need to like frantically take notes if you're a note taker. And the first, this sounds really simple, but we know that it's not as simple as it sounds, is to pay attention. Paying attention when we are active listening really requires managing our environment. And sometimes that is easier to do than others. But it does mean things like muting the notifications on our phone and doing our best to kind of compartmentalize and put away some of those distracting thoughts, right? We need to worry about that meeting with our boss in the afternoon later when we get to it, not right now when we're in session. And we're focused not on what we are going to say next, but what is being said to us. It's also really important that we demonstrate that listening, that we show the client that we're really engaged with them. And this is where we're going to use our own body language and our own attunement. It's nodding along, using our facial expressions. If you're doing remote work with client, using really exaggerated facial expressions even, like go beyond what you normally would, because you're losing some of that body language with remote. Being aware of our posture, making sure that we're open, we're inviting. And I also encourage you to really try to tune into what your client is giving you in terms of body language and mirror that as much as possible. So for example, many of us are kind of brought up with certain expectations around how much eye contact to give in a conversation. And eye contact really varies for people and their comfortability. If I'm in a session with Melina and I'm noticing that Melina's not giving me any eye contact, but I'm like staring directly into her face, that's probably going to make Melina really uncomfortable, right? So a way that I can show that I'm listening is tuning into her level of eye contact and mirroring it, right? But still using my body language to be engaged. We also want to think about our tone and our volume. I'm a loud person. I'm a very loud person. And when I have a client come into a session, if their tone is all the way down here and I come at them all the way up here, I'm not matching them, right? And so that in a way will make them feel not heard, right? Because I'm over here on a 10 and they're on a 2. We also want to be providing feedback when we're listening. And I don't necessarily mean feedback in terms of like, wow, Alexa, you did a great job with that. But feedback more thinking about, like to Kat's point earlier about rephrasing and reframing. I think a couple of folks on this call were in our motivational interviewing training. So if you were in that motivational interviewing training and you remember how we talked about affirmations, an affirmation would be an example of a way you can give feedback, right? Because you're reflecting on the action or the thing that the person said and connecting it back to their values. So providing feedback can really be as simple as saying, Cheryl, what I'm hearing you say is, right? That feedback just lets them know that you're engaged. Also, when we reframe or when we provide an affirmation, it gives the client an opportunity to tell us, actually, Kate, you didn't get that right. That's not what I was trying to say. And that'll give us a lot more information. We also want to be mindful of deferring judgment. And this can be really challenging. And I want to name that this is not an easy thing to do. But it's really important to really just pause and let them get everything out, right? We want to be mindful of interruptions and not just loading our counter argument the whole time we're in a session. And finally, we want to respond appropriately. And that means really just being candid and honest in response. When somebody asks for input or when they ask for our opinion, we want to be genuine in that. But we also can do that with respect, right? I'm on a personal mission to eliminate the phrase brutal honesty, because honesty shouldn't be and doesn't need to be brutal, right? We can, with kindness and with respect, tell somebody, Kirsten, I'm not sure we're on the right track with that, right? We can be really respectful in the way that we give that feedback. I'd like to pause here and just invite some reflections on either the levels of listening and active listening. Is there anything that's standing out to folks here? Yes, Kat, whole body listening is very challenging in the remote world. We lose so much of that connection when we are remote, especially when we're in settings where, if our clients have unstable access to internet or to technology, right? Maybe we're doing a lot of phone sessions, or sometimes cameras work, sometimes cameras don't. Sometimes we're in a meeting with a client and we can tell they have like 9,000 other things going on. In some of the work that I did with high schoolers, when we did have to be hybrid, it was really challenging to work with a team when you could hear that they were taking care of all their siblings, right? They were the oldest sibling in the house and they were babysitting 4 other kids while we were trying to do a coaching session. What are some ways in doing remote work? What are some things that folks have found that help them to tune in more closely on that conversation? What helps there? Rachel says, changing the environment you're in if you can. Absolutely. And I think that can be one of the benefits to remote work, is that if you are in the office and you're doing Zoom meetings with clients, Man, I've taken calls from the boiler room plenty of times because it was the quietest, most private space I could, right? And sometimes it means, yeah, you're gonna drag your laptop into an electrical closet for a half hour. But if that's what's available to you and you can do that, sometimes that can help. Silencing notifications on the computer and phone calls, doing really intentional one-on-ones. Whenever you're able to do not disturb your notifications, whether you're meeting with the client or not, I really do. Lives better. I'm just taking notes. I am a note taker as well. Taking notes is a way that I think that when we think about taking notes, the only thing to consider is that transparency piece. Furiously typing during a session, I will let them know, like, hey, Lartanja, just so you know, note taking helps me listen. You're welcome to see my notes, right? And I'll show people the notes. But that can definitely be a great way to focus in. And if that works for your brain, I encourage you to do that. When we think about these levels of listening and these keys to active listening, does anybody want to share, is there a component of this that you feel like you are already strong in? Any reflections on things that people feel like they're doing pretty well? While folks consider that, one kind of last note on active listening, right, is there will always be some things that are in our control and some things that are not, right? And so as we're looking at these keys and we're thinking about these levels of listening, really hone in on what is in your control, right? Maybe you have to work in the office and you will kind of always hear the person sitting next to you, right? So what are some other things that are within your sphere of control that can support you in engaging in these deeper levels of listening? So we're going to move into some conversation around powerful questions next. Oh, fantastic. In the chat, Angela says, I think providing feedback is something I do well. It goes along with bottom lining. If we're really listening well, we can summarize what they're saying, reflect, and paraphrase. Absolutely. Providing that feedback is a really helpful tool when you are working on bottom lining as well. So I appreciate the way you connected those two things. Deferring judgment. Save it for conversations with a supervisor or a coworker. Don't show it with the client. We do have to kind of have that poker face. And I will kind of add with that, one thing that helps me is reframing and rephrasing it. If a client tells me something and I don't know how to handle it, or it's something I wasn't expecting and it kind of throws me for a loop, if my instinct reaction is, Rachel, what I'm hearing you say is, that's going to buy me at least 45 seconds to kind of process that information myself and regroup so that we can move on without losing that focus or without showing judgment. Sometimes that happens really instinctively, right? Like sometimes a client will share something that really throws us for a loop and they can see it written on our face plain as day, right? And there is some practice to that, of keeping that kind of neutral facial expression, but staying engaged, reframing. And then, work with your supervisor after the fact. If it's, oh my goodness, like Rachel shared this with me and I'm really not sure how to handle it, right? That's what our supervisors are for. So when we think about these powerful questions, there's a couple of kind of key components that make a question powerful. Powerful questions should give rise to clarity, action, and discovery. These will go deeper than our typical assessment questions. One feature of a powerful question is they get to the bottom line. Long, wandering, multi-part questions are really difficult to answer, and we risk losing the client. This is something that I've had to practice a lot, is just asking one question at a time. Sometimes when a client is sharing something with us and our questions really start going, we might ask them 4 questions in a row without taking a breath. Wow, tell me more about that. How did all of that happen? And what are you going to do next? That's an overwhelming amount of questions, right? So starting with just one question at a time and really getting to the root of what it is you want to know. Powerful questions are open-ended. What do you need right now? Versus, are you hungry? Closed-ended questions are going to evoke a yes or a no answer. And when we use them, we are subtly telling the client that I, the coach, have the answer. Closed-ended questions will often inform our agenda as a coach, but will not help further the client's agenda. And they don't encourage that dialogue or deeper learning and exploration. So when we're using these open-ended questions, we want to consider questions that will require more than yes, no, or a 1 or 2 word answer. Yes, Kat, go ahead.
I am curious on this open-endedness because I feel called out like, oh gosh, I definitely asked those yes or no questions to get through preliminary assessments. And that's that initial, it's allowing the participant to say, okay, this is how things are going to go moving forward. When in reality, I could be more open-ended. So could you specifically, Kate, or someone else here, give some examples of like what has been helpful in them to bring more open-endedness to those initial conversations, so it shows that participant we are really, invested in not maybe having all the answers, but helping them get there. Because again, I think it goes back to that fixer mindset that I have. So if anybody can speak on that, or you, I would appreciate that.
Sure. I can share. I have an example in mind, and then I'll turn it over to the group because I'd love to hear from some other folks too. So closed-ended questions do have a place in assessment, right? There just are things that we need to know that we really only need a small amount of information for. A thing that I'm thinking of is understanding a client's work history, right? So a lot of times in that initial assessment or that initial employment plan, we're going to be asking some questions about work history. And a lot of the forms that I've had from funders are just things like, where did you work? How long did you work there? What was your job title? What'd you do there? That's going to give me some information, right? I'm going to know that Kat hasn't worked in 6 months and that most of her experience has been in food manufacturing. Cool. That's great. That's good stuff to know. But if that's all I know, then I'm going to think, okay, well, her experience is in food manufacturing. We'll look at food manufacturing jobs. But if I dig a little deeper on that and I ask, Kat, what did you like about your job at, blanking on any company name in food manufacturing, even though I've worked with a million of them. What did you like about your experience at Midwest Foods? that's much more open-ended, right? That invites you to really reflect on what were the components of that job that you liked. And then if I follow it up with what was challenging about that, I'm going to get some more information. So in a lot of the work that I've done in working with reentry, a lot of the folks that I worked with had this kind of internal and external messaging that the jobs that they were a good fit for were warehousing jobs. Warehousing jobs are a very specific type of repetitive hard work. Warehousing jobs are really challenging. And so they would have had warehousing experience, and they would tell me that their goal was to work in a warehouse. We were doing transitional jobs, so I would have the opportunity to actually do hands-on work with them as well. And then I would find out this person hates doing the same task for more than an hour, right? If they're doing repetitive work for an hour and a half, 2 hours, I'm losing them, right? They're wandering off, they're going and doing other stuff, right? So those open-ended questions in that employment assessment are going to get beyond just what have you done before and what do you think you want to do next? I'd love to hear from some other folks. Are there ways that you balance kind of adding maybe a couple extra open-ended questions into some of those assessments?
This is Lartanja.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lartanja.
Okay, so what I do is I work with the young adults within this program that I'm with Viola, and with the preliminary assessment form that we give to the customers, I've created a list of additional questions that I ask them to have them to open up a little bit more. Like I asked them, like, what are your plans, let's say a year from now, what do you see yourself doing or would like to be doing? And then I broaden it out, like maybe 3 to 5 years, what do you see yourself doing then? Then I ask about their hobbies, I ask about their brothers and sisters and things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that, because you're going to do a couple things there, right? You're building that relationship first. Right? If I'm in a session with a coach and they're asking me about my family and they remember my sister's name and they, remember some of the details about, I told them I was going to a birthday party last week. That makes me feel like, ooh, Lartanja was paying attention to me. I like that. And it's also when we ask about things that are seemingly unrelated to employment, asking about hobbies is great, because hobbies are what we actually enjoy doing. Right? Nobody has a hobby that they hate, but we've all probably had jobs that we didn't like. Angela, you were going to add something.
Oh, just in my job, we will support students in going to college if that's going to help them work toward a job goal. And one of my jobs is to be able to say, this is why I think they're going to be successful in this endeavor. So I have to ask questions like, first of all, how did you decide that this is the job goal that you want to have? What happened, what in your life has led you to have this interest? But then also, why have you chosen this field? So I guess the how and the why questions to kind of get a bigger picture of why should we support them? What is it in your background? What are you good at? Why do I think you're going to be a good college student? You're going to be successful. So anyway, that seems kind of simple, but that's something I do.
Yeah, I think those how questions are really, really important. And I think especially if you're working with young people, or even if you're working with just a client where you see they've got one type of experience, how did you get into that type of work? That's going to tell us something, right? Is that young person telling you that they want to study business because that's what somebody else told them they'd be good at? Or do they have an idea of a business that they want to start after school, right? And are they really interested in the idea of entrepreneurship? So when we're thinking about these closed versus open, there is a little bit of a balance to it. And we'll ask more closed-ended questions when we're kind of early in that assessment phase, right? How far did you get in school? Closed-ended question. It's going to give us some information. We need that information. It'll inform some things down the road. But we also want to, if we're really kind of tuned into that conversation, we might pick up on something in that person's response that wants us to that we might want to dig a little deeper on that. Tell me more about your decision to leave school. I also, if you can't tell, I love tell me more about. That can be a helpful one. And that kind of leads into this idea of curiosity and wonder. So these questions are really coming from a place of curiosity. We're not asking questions to make a point. How'd that go for you? That's a question asked to make a point, right? Have you tried? That's a question that's asked to open up the door for us to give advice. Our questions should be learning focused. They'll be asked for the benefit of greater awareness, learning, and discovery, not to satisfy our goals, right? But a really good, powerful question is going to help us understand that person in a deeper way. And they'll help us move forward and dig deeper, right? So powerful questions should help drive that conversation, again, towards that kind of action-oriented piece of coaching. When we're asking powerful questions, we want to really exercise judgment around when we use the question why. Why can be appropriate sometimes. Why can also be perceived as inviting judgment. So I want to just kind of acknowledge that we want to be careful with why. If a client believes that our level of questioning is a form of judgment, that could derail the whole conversation. And there's ways that we can get out that why without saying why. How'd you come to that conclusion? Could you tell me what was happening before you did X, Y, and Z? So I want to just kind of name that. Sometimes why can put people on the defense. So we are right at the top of the hour. So why don't we take 5 minutes and do a quick break? Fill up your coffee, grab some water, stretch around. We will come back at 11:05. Do a little individual review for a few minutes. So in your participant guide, there is a list. It starts on page 13 and it goes through page 15. It's a long list of powerful questions that you could use. So kind of similar to how Lartanja named that she has like an additional list of supplemental questions. These are all things that you can have these questions like in your back pocket so that you could pull them out during a session. So we'll take about 5 minutes for folks to individually review that list. And I want to invite you to consider what are some questions that you'd like to try? What questions seem challenging? And are there any questions that you would add? So we'll take 5 minutes for this individual review, and then we will come back as a group to reflect back on them. People, what are some questions that you would like to try or that seem challenging? Any of these questions stand out as ones you might want to try to incorporate in a session? What does a day in your ideal career or job look like? I love that. Also, as I'm working towards doing a better job being consistent and checking in with customers and meeting with them, just asking, what could you accomplish by the next time we meet will help us move forward. That's great, because that will help you move forward. It gives you a concrete thing to follow up on, and it's giving that client that choice and that agency to say, this is a reasonable expectation for what I can do between now and then. I'd like to try, what will follow up look like? Since I normally try to tell them how to follow up with me. I've never thought about giving them the option of telling me, because follow-up can be hard to obtain sometimes. That's great. If you're having a hard time getting in touch with people for follow-up, sometimes that is just asking them, like, what does that look like for you? Sometimes it can be as simple as, like, if you call me and I don't know the number, I'm not picking it up and I don't listen to my voicemail, right? A lot of people don't. So maybe a text would work better. That could be a really, really simple shift that could take that process from being extremely frustrating to working pretty well. So part of the coaching process is not just having the right worksheet or the right question list, right? But it's using our own skills and intuition to know when to ask the right question. So having a list like this can be really helpful because it gives us more tools, but we'll have to use our own coaching skills to determine when that question's right. I would ask, what is your vision for life? And how will you know that you've met your goal? I love these visioning questions because it's going to tell us something deeper about that client, right? Because most of us do have a vision for what is next year going to be? What's 5 years, right? Even if it's not necessarily super clear, part of that coaching process can be helping someone kind of figure out that visioning process. Any other reflections on the powerful questions?
Hey, Kate, this is Kat. I felt like it was a little easier to take myself off mute. I agreed with what those have shared. And in addition, something that seems very challenging to ask for me is, how will you know when to celebrate your success? Or how would you like to create accountability for yourself? Because I had a recent conversation with a participant who wanted to jump right into tasks with me. And I could sense some tension. I could sense some frustration in her tone. So I said, hey, so-and-so, what are you doing to celebrate how far you've come thus far? Like, what steps are you taking to pat yourself on the back, to allow for some self-care throughout this process? And she said, well, I'm not. And I said, okay, just remember and I try to encourage them. But I think for me, it's a challenging question to ask because I don't want to come off like, I don't know, like I'm too woo-woo, but then that is part of the process because we are cheerleading as much as we are coaching and counseling. And also to creating accountability, I think that there's an expectation, a misunderstanding that I need to be accountable for my participants where they are at all times, but that accountability comes from the participant wanting to seek services from us. And so trying to remind myself, again, I'm not here to fix. If somebody wants help, they will seek out the services. I just have to do my best by following up with them if they do reach out or giving those action steps. So I would say those are some challenges, but I do agree with adding, what could you accomplish by the next time we meet? Because I just think that's a very powerful question. So those were my thoughts to this exercise.
Yeah, I love the question around how are you celebrating? And I'm curious to hear from other people, have you encountered that response of I'm not? And what has your approach to that been? While folks are reflecting on that, I think, Kat, in that situation, that can be a really tricky thing, right? One thing about powerful questions is we don't always get the answer that we were expecting. And I can definitely resonate with that feeling of sometimes self-care doesn't land quite right. Right. And if somebody is really struggling and we're their coach and we're telling them like, but self-care, but celebrate, but they're really struggling, right? That might not land well with them. Right. And so what I might encourage you to consider is what are some ways that you could maybe consider using that whole body listening to match and tune in with some of the nonverbal cues you're giving to start, and then name progress in a celebratory way, right? So being mindful that if we are working with a client who's saying, that's not that big a deal, I had to do that anyway, but they accomplished something and we want to acknowledge that, right? If we come in and we're like, oh my God, Kat, I'm so proud of you. I can't believe it. You did the thing. It was so hard. Then they're going to feel like, why are you acting like this? Right. So maybe we do need to take a more subtle approach, though, of really naming the thing that they accomplished. Like, Kat, I think it seems like it was really hard for you to get this done because I know you had a lot of other things going on this week. So I just want to name that. I think it's great that you did that. I think it's great that you made it to your appointment on time today, because I know that was challenging for you. And they might brush that off and be like, yeah, whatever, I have to be on time. But if we're doing that in kind of a consistent way over time, that might, for that person, help build that skill of seeing their own strengths and accomplishments. Because that is also a skill that I think many of us struggle with, is naming and seeing our own strengths and accomplishments. And you're right, there is some nuance there to how we ask that question. And I love that you use the phrase woo-woo, because I've totally experienced that before, where I'm like the big cheerleader and everybody's like, you need to calm down. The other piece that you named was around that accountability, right? And how do you want to be held accountable? And I think that would be a good one to just try out and see how it goes. And sometimes people will struggle with how they respond to that, because a lot of times we don't necessarily know what accountability will look like. And so it may mean naming for yourself, like when you're going through your action items at the end of the meeting, okay, so, before we meet next time, you said that you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. So I'm accountable for these things. And I'm going to be checking in with myself on Wednesday before we meet the following Thursday to make sure that I've done that. How would you like to hold yourself accountable? Right? So if somebody's kind of lost on that, maybe giving an example of what that would look like to you and then flipping it back at them, that could be a way to do that if they're like looking at you like, what do you mean? Any other reflections on any of these questions before we move into another group activity? All right. So we are going to head into another breakout room, and I want for folks to consider that you achieved a challenging goal. So the reflection is kind of similar to what we did earlier today, but we're going to be thinking about a different thing. So consider a time that you achieved a goal, something that really pushed you, something that you really had to work hard on. And what was it that helped you succeed? And then the second piece of this is maybe consider a time when you set a goal, but you either didn't achieve it or you experienced some setbacks along the way. And what was missing from that? So these questions are in your participant guide on page 16, we'll spend about 7 minutes in these breakout rooms thinking about that process of goal achievement. When we've met a goal, what really contributed to that success? And when we've experienced those setbacks, what were some of the pieces that were missing from that? So Melina, if you want to go ahead and open those breakout rooms whenever you're ready. Grow. So we acknowledge that for a value to be real, we have to act on it. We have to put it into practice. And incorporating this coaching approach, it may mean making some changes to the way that we engage with clients. Many people who are currently being case managed or counseled or taught at our agencies might find a shift to a coaching approach a little different or unexpected. And you might find shifting to a coaching approach to be a little different or unexpected. But to really embody these values, we have to be ready to act on them, right? We have to be ready to have the client be the one in the driver's seat, to have the client be the one that's moving the ball forward, to not be giving advice, which is often the easier thing to do, but to share really transparently and honestly with clients what we value and how we want to collaborate with them going forward. And this value of transparency can be really important if incorporating some of these strategies we've talked about will feel like a big shift for you. So it can be as simple as saying in a session, hey, Melina, I'd like to try something a little bit new today. Or I'm working on taking kind of a more collaborative approach. So I'd like to try some new things in our work together. Is that okay with you? And that transparency and vulnerability can be hard on our part, right? Because we also want to be perceived as professionals. We want for folks to trust in us, that we know what to do, that we have the answers. But it's a much more powerful impact when the client is finding their own answers, right? And we're just kind of the guide on the side. What reactions do folks have to this idea of reframing the way that you work with clients? We're going to do one final reflection where we'll have some opportunity to consider this reframe a little bit further. There are some guiding questions in your participant guide. This starts kind of at the bottom of page 16 and goes on to page 17. So we'll take about, let's say, 5 minutes individually to consider these questions in your participant guide. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms to reflect on them in groups. Melina, could you drop that link to the participant guide just one more time, just in case anybody still needs it? So we'll take until 11:45 on page 16 and 17 for folks to reflect on these questions in your guide. And then we'll do just like a 7-minute breakout room to share out.